Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to be able to speak here tonight for the bill about the Museum of Canadian History. And as a person who's been an educator for 18 years, professional educator, I've taught every grade in the classroom from 4th grade to graduate studies at the university level. Served as a vice principal and a principal of public schools as well. It's great to be here and support this bill. You know, it's a bill that supports the teaching and education of history to many, many thousands of Canadians from one end of this country to another. And when you think about the way history is being taught in Canada right now, there needs to be some improvements. I think it's disgraceful that, in fact, that we only have 3 out of 10 provinces who have the teaching of history as a required course for graduation. That means 7 out of 10 provinces from coast to coast to coast have history courses taught basically as an elective. I don't understand how we're going to reach the potential that is Canada, the potential that our nation can achieve, if we don't teach the next generation where we're from and who we are. So I think this needs to change. Now, as we all know, the teaching and curriculum development is a provincial jurisdiction, it's a provincial mandate. But what can the federal government do to support the education of our young people, to support the teaching of history in Canada? Well, I think this bill is one step forward to making sure that the citizens of Canada, the next generation of Canadians, have a greater opportunity to take a look at Canada and understand who we are and where we come from. Because if they have a better understanding of that, they will increasingly have a better understanding of who we can be and who we will be, and how we're going to reach the potential, the great potential that is Canada. In the end, this bill is about who we are and who we can be. So whether your ancestors came to Canada across a land bridge from Asia, or whether they first set foot in North America to exploit our great cod stocks on the Grand Banks, or whether they established settlements in Annapolis Royal and survived scurvy and, of course, the harsh winters, or whether they built Acadian dikes and established agriculture on the east coast of our country, or whether they escaped religious intolerance in Europe for more freedom for their beliefs in this country, or whether they escaped slavery in the United States and escaped to Canada through the Underground Railroad led by great Canadians like Harriet Tubman, or whether they avoided the potato famine in Ireland and immigrated to Canada, or whether your ancestors, like some of my ancestors and some of the ancestors of the Minister of National Defence, sailed to Canada on the Hector with the Camerons, the McNeils, the McDonalds, and the McKays, or whether they immigrated to Canada from China and helped develop the railway, which united this country from coast to coast, or whether they fled Nazism and the Holocaust in Europe in the 30s and 40s, or the totalitarianism and the communism in the Cold War in Eastern Europe, or whether in fact they simply sailed up to our shores as refugees from Vietnam. This museum will stand for all of them, and I support this museum and I support this legislation. For this is our story, it's a Canadian story. Canada is the world's home. We've accepted Canadians from across this globe who are coming here to seek their fortune, coming here for prosperity, coming to avoid persecution, coming for freedom, coming to be able to respect the religion and the beliefs they want to respect. And Canada respects all these people who have immigrated here. And we're going to have a museum which reflects that respect, which reflects those beliefs, which reflects the history that is Canada. The second largest nation on the planet, with a relatively small population, with vast natural resources, our future is bright. Canada is a beacon of prosperity, and when you look across the world right now at the economic struggles many of our neighbors are facing, we truly are a beacon of hope. We truly are a light at the end of the tunnel. Canada is experiencing a better recovery from the greatest depression since the Great Depression of the 30s than any other nation in the G8. Thanks to the leadership of our Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, we are emerging from that recession in a stronger position than anyone else, positioning our country for greatness for generations to come. This museum, this ability to help people coming to Canada, to help people who have lived in Canada for generations understand where our nation was founded, how we've grown, and where we can go. That is what this museum is all about, and that's why I support this museum. Now, how this museum will operate, people from across the country before would have to come to our national museums, whether they be Pier 21 in Halifax or whether it be here in Ottawa. They'd have to come and see what was contained in our national museums. The way we're changing how this museum is going to work is we're going to partner with museums all across the country. From Terrace, British Columbia, to Tatamagouche, Nova Scotia, to Weyburn, Saskatchewan, all across this nation, small museums are going to be able to have artifacts from these large museums and stores here. And anyone who understands how museums work, at any given time, about 80% of the artifacts they have are kept in the attic or kept in the basement. We're going to free those artifacts from the attic. We're going to free them from the basement. We're going to move them across the country. So literally thousands and thousands of Canadians who have never had the opportunity to see these artifacts, to see what the history of this nation truly is. Those who would not have the finances to travel from one end of this nation to the other, they will be able to experience this in their hometowns, in their home communities, and their home museums will be able to exploit this to help build the resources they need to celebrate their individual culture, their individual history in those communities as well. It's a win-win situation for our small museums and for all Canadians across the country. And that is why we are putting forward this legislation. That is why this plan will best serve Canadians from coast to coast to coast. Whether you're rich, whether you're poor, you're going to be able to see the true Canadian cultural experience right there in your home museum, in your hometown. That is why we support this legislation. That is why Canada will prosper. Well, small museums will prosper and small communities will prosper from this legislation. And what might be contained in some of these communities? What might be able to travel? Artifacts from Marconi's radio, Bell's telephone. We might be able to have something, exhibits from the Canadarm. And we can celebrate great Canadians, like Harriet Tubman I mentioned before in the Underground Railroad, like Adam Beach, like Tecumseh, like artifacts from the War of 1812. Like artifacts from the battles like Vimy Ridge and our great military history we have in Canada, all these things will now be able to travel in showcases from across this country, from coast to coast to coast, so that all Canadians will be able to enjoy them. You know, Canada is a special place, a place that we can all be proud of, and a place that we should continuously celebrate. And as I said at the beginning of my remarks, if we don't know who we are, if we don't know where we're from, if we don't know how we came to be, how can we achieve the greatness that Canada can be? How can we achieve that potential that every member of Parliament is here to make sure that we all achieve together? So I'm very proud to support this legislation. I'm very proud that we are putting this forward. I encourage all members from all parties across this House to get behind our National History Museum. And any of us who've traveled to the United States or traveled to the German Museum of History have seen what kind of artifacts can be contained in these great national museums. This will be our Smithsonian. This will be our national museum, a Canadian national museum, celebrating great Canadians like Terry Fox, celebrating great Canadians like all the prime ministers that have come before the current prime minister, celebrating great Canadians like Banning and Best and all of the people who have put forward the scientific achievements that is Canada. Mr. Speaker, I know my time is coming to an end, but I would like to say I strongly support this legislation. I credit the minister for putting this forward. I think this is going to be a true national treasure for all Canadians to enjoy from coast to coast to coast. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions and commentary. The Honourable Member for Western Arctic.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for an entertaining address on Canadian history. I found it to be his version of Canadian history to be interesting, as I suppose each one of us in this room would have our version of Canadian history, or what we think is important and how it should be displayed. He talked about small museums, though, and I sat on the board of a small museum called the Northern Light Museum in Fort Smith, where we actually had a great collection collected by the Oblate priests from all over the north, 10,000 items. It's all in the National Registry now. We at the time got great displays from from the national museums. In our museum, that's what happened. We actually had a museum assistance program. And in the 80s, we used to get $25,000 for our museum from the central government. That museum assistance program never got any bigger in size and eventually was cut out by the Conservatives. Museums across the country, small museums, need some support financially. Mr. Speaker, what is this going to do for my small museum in my community?
Member for Cumberland, Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Well, I want to thank the honourable member for his question. In fact, that is the centerpiece of this. Not only are we going to build a great museum here in Ottawa that people can travel to Canada from both domestically and foreign people can travel here and visit that museum, there's going to be the ability for great treasures that are contained in that museum to move across the country so that all Canadians can enjoy them. And I'm very proud that we are one of the few nations in the G8 that during this time of economic difficulty across the globe, we've actually increased the funding we put forward for arts and culture in Canada. When all the other countries are in fact cutting that money, we're increasing that. This is another step we are taking to support our small museums and our rural communities in particular, giving them the opportunities that they haven't had before.
The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems to me from listening to the speeches from the government side that there's a heavy emphasis on the civic and political side of history that really has a direct civic and political relevance. But there are other aspects important aspects to Canadian history which I think are important to emphasize. And I'm a little bit worried that this new renaming the museum and the emphasis put on this Canadian Museum of History is going to miss some of this. And this gets back to my colleague from the Western Arctic who mentioned a small museum and asking about whether the small museum would be able to receive funding. There's a museum, a very important museum in my writing, the Canadian Museum of Healthcare, which is the only museum of its type in the country, and it is short of funds. It needs to find funding to preserve the history of healthcare in Canada. It's an enormous collection, and I guess my question is that if this emphasis on the civic and political side of history will miss an important part of history. In this case, healthcare, but it could also be science and technology. And I was wondering if my colleague could address this question.
The honourable member for Cumberland, Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
We have all kinds of museums across the country. We have the Museum of Science and Technology across the country. I think that our government has done an amazing job of funding museums, particularly our national museums. I think of Pier 21 in Halifax and close to my riding, which celebrates immigration, which I talked about in my speech. So I think that we have increased the funding for globally museums across the country. This program is going to allow artifacts from the National Museum to travel across the country. But I don't think we have to take any lessons on history from the Liberal Party when they have a leader that said all the best prime ministers come from Quebec. He said Mulroney, Trudeau, Chrétien, as if there was never a prime minister ever elected before 1968. That is the Liberal Party's legacy here.
I think we have time for one more quick question or comment, and given the effort that the member for Crowfoot put into getting back to his seat in time, I think I'll give him the floor for the last one on this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At this hour, any movement is an effort, I think. But, Mr. Speaker, I just want to commend this member for his speech. I sat and listened to this speech, and obviously he has been an educator, not only in Nova Scotia, but my understanding, although I don't know him really well, is that he was out west as well, and he's taught across the country. I wonder if he would just expand a little bit. One of the things that I try to understand from what they're trying to do here is how students from schools might now be able to take a road trip or take a field trip to a local museum that up until now, especially in the West, has had very limited artifacts. It would have about the West, it would have a little bit, but now some key Canadian national type of artifacts can actually show up in rural Alberta, rural Saskatchewan. How's that going to help teachers?
The honourable member from Cumberland, Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley has only about 20 seconds left.
Well, I'll try to be very quick, but in many small rural communities in particular, and I've taught in several of those, they might have a local museum which really celebrates their community's history, the history of that small area of our country. And the children will go there in elementary. maybe in first or second grade, and then probably third or fourth grade, another teacher will take them down to the same museum and see the same artifacts, and then they might go there again if a different teacher in grade 8 or 9. This will give them the ability to maybe see something like Terry Fox's van, which will be traveling the country from our National Museum. It'll provide new artifacts that inspire
Resuming.